In the quaint town of Willow Creek, where secrets whispered through the walls, I found myself drawn into a chilling nightmare that forever haunted my nights. Our new neighbor, Mrs. Hawthorne, was an enigma, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes and a perpetual frown etched upon her face. She kept to herself, her presence casting an eerie pall over the neighborhood. One stormy evening, as the wind howled like a banshee and rain lashed mercilessly against my window, I received an unexpected visit from Mrs. Hawthorne. Her frail body trembled as she knocked timidly on my door, her voice a mere whisper. "Excuse me, my dear," she uttered, her words carried by the gale. "Could you spare a moment?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. A sense of foreboding washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn her away. Opening the door, I was met with a sight that sent shivers down my spine. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes were wide and glassy, their pupils dilated to an unnatural size. Her once pale skin had taken on an ashen hue, and her lips were parted in a silent scream. "Please," she whispered again, "I need your help." Unable to resist her plea, I invited her inside. As she settled into an armchair, her trembling hands clutching her worn handbag, she began to unravel a tale of unspeakable horror. She spoke of her late husband, a cruel and abusive man who had haunted her every waking moment. Even after his death, she claimed, his malevolent spirit refused to leave her alone. It tormented her with terrifying visions, whispered threats in the dead of night, and left eerie markings on the walls of her home. As she relayed her experiences, I felt a growing sense of unease. The darkness outside seemed to press closer, and the shadows in my own home danced ominously. I wanted to dismiss her story as the ramblings of a deranged mind, but there was something in her hollow eyes that made me believe every word. "I've tried everything," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice breaking. "Priests, mediums, even the police. But nothing has helped. I'm desperate, my dear. I need someone to protect me." Cold fear gripped me. I had never been one for the supernatural, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this frail woman to face her torment alone. "I'll help you," I said. In the days that followed, I became Mrs. Hawthorne's constant companion. I spent hours at her home, listening to her chilling accounts of ghostly encounters and trying to comfort her as best I could. But despite my efforts, the situation only seemed to worsen. The strange markings on her walls became more frequent, and her visions grew more vivid. Sleep eluded both of us, our nights filled with a constant sense of dread. One fateful night, as we sat in her living room, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped us, and a cold wind swept through the open window. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper behind me. "She's here," the voice hissed. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was nothing to be seen. "Don't worry," Mrs. Hawthorne whispered. "She's just trying to scare you." But her words were barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something evil was lurking in the shadows, watching our every move. Fear consumed me, and I knew I had to escape. As I stumbled to my feet, I heard a blood-curdling scream pierce the silence. I rushed to Mrs. Hawthorne's side, but it was too late. Her body lay lifeless on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. The walls were covered in blood, and the air was thick with an acrid stench. I fled from the house, the horrors I had witnessed forever etched into my memory. The police never found any evidence of a crime, and Mrs. Hawthorne's death was ruled an accident. But I knew better. The evil that had haunted her had claimed another victim, and I was now forever marked by the nightmare I had endured. To this day, the thought of my neighbor's haunted house sends shivers down my spine. The secrets that lie within its walls remain a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary of places. And as I lie awake at night, I can still hear the faint whisper, "She's here," echoing through the shadows. In the quaint cul-de-sac where I have resided for the past decade, an eerie silence had settled upon the neighborhood. The once familiar laughter of children and the cheerful greetings of neighbors had vanished into a haunting vacuum. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, had always been a comforting presence. Her warm smile and gentle nature had made me feel safe in this otherwise unfamiliar town. But lately, something had changed. Her drapes remained drawn, and I hadn't seen her emerge from her home for days. Concerned, I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Day after day, I returned, each time met with the same deafening silence. A sense of unease began to gnaw at me. One stormy evening, as the wind howled and rain battered against the windows, I decided to investigate further. Armed with a flashlight, I cautiously approached Mrs. Jenkins' house. The windows were dark, and an oppressive silence hung in the air. With trembling hands, I pushed open the creaking door. A rancid odor permeated the house, making me gag. As I stepped inside, I noticed a trail of something dark and viscous leading down the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the trail. It led me to the living room, where a horrifying scene unfolded before my eyes. Mrs. Jenkins' lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, her eyes wide and filled with terror. Her skin was pale and mottled, her limbs contorted in an unnatural way. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the once pristine carpet. Above her, a grotesque figure loomed, its eyes glowing an eerie red in the dim light. The creature's skin was a sickly shade of green, and its razor-sharp teeth protruded from a wide, gaping maw. Its claws glistened with a malevolent light as it slowly approached me. Frozen in terror, I could only watch as the creature bent down and whispered something into Mrs. Jenkins' ear. A guttural laugh escaped its lips, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, the creature's gaze turned to me. Its eyes narrowed, and it let out a deafening roar. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rug and landing with a thud on the floor. The creature lunged forward, its claws reaching for me. I screamed in terror and rolled out of the way just in time, crashed into the wall, sending splinters flying everywhere. Time seemed to slow down as I scrambled to my feet and ran for my life. The creature pursued me, its heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I could hear its raspy breathing as it gained on me. Desperate, I burst through the front door and into the raging storm. The rain drenched my clothes, but I didn't care. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Finally, I collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath. As the storm raged around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the horror I had witnessed was only the beginning. My once peaceful neighborhood had become a nightmare, and I was trapped within it. Days turned into nights as I lived in fear, barricading my doors and windows. Every creak in the house sent shivers down my spine, and I could never quite shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, one night, it came for me. The creature burst through my window, its claws dripping with blood. I fought back with all my might, but it was no use. In the end, I was no match for its inhuman strength. As the darkness enveloped me, I realized that I had become the latest victim in a gruesome tale of horror. My neighbor, the once kind and gentle Mrs. Jenkins, had been transformed into a monstrous killer, and now I was paying the ultimate price. In the quaint little town of Willow Creek, where shadows danced ominously in the twilight, there was an unassuming house that whispered secrets of unspeakable horror. It was where I found myself, a solitary tenant drawn into a dark and twisted nightmare. From the moment I crossed the threshold, a palpable sense of unease clung to the air. The walls seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with their oppressive presence. Footsteps echoed in the empty halls, and the creaking of floorboards sent shivers down my spine. My neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, was an enigma. Her eyes held a vacant stare, and her skin had the translucent pallor of a corpse. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a raspy whisper that chilled me to the bone. One stormy night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the wall that separated our houses. It was a persistent, maddening rhythm that gnawed at my sanity. As the scratching grew louder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to break through. Panic surged through me as I stumbled out of bed and approached the wall. To my horror, I saw a tiny crack appearing, slowly widening with each passing moment. I pressed my ear against the opening, hoping to hear a rational explanation, but instead, I was met with an eerie silence. Days turned into nights as the scratching persisted, each sound a relentless reminder of the unknown terror lurking just beyond the wall. I lost all sense of time, my sleep disturbed by nightmares that left me drenched in cold sweat. One fateful evening, as I sat by the window watching the storm rage outside, I noticed a peculiar movement in the reflection of my neighbor's window. It was the silhouette of a figure, contorted and grotesque, slowly approaching my side of the wall. A paralyzing fear gripped me as I realized the true nature of the horror that had been tormenting me. It was Mrs. Hawthorne, her body twisted in an unnatural way, her eyes glowing an eerie red. With a bone-chilling scream, she lunged at me through the widening crack in the wall. Her talon-like nails raked across my skin, leaving bloody gashes that burned with an unholy fire. In that moment, I fought back with all my might. I grabbed a nearby vase and smashed it over her head, sending shards of glass flying. The impact seemed to stun her, but it was not enough to stop her. As she continued her relentless assault, I knew I had to escape. I stumbled backward, knocking over a bookshelf that blocked her path. With newfound resolve, I fled into the darkness. I ran through the house, the sound of her footsteps pounding behind me. I could feel her hot breath on my neck, her laughter echoing through the empty halls. The nightmare had become a reality, and I was its intended victim. Finally, I reached the front door and stumbled outside into the raging storm. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the wall collapsing, the bricks crumbling to dust. As I escaped Willow Creek that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true horror of Mrs. Hawthorne's curse would forever haunt my dreams. The memory of her twisted form and the sound of her raspy laughter would remain an eternal reminder of the nightmare I had endured.